Okay, good afternoon, everybody. It's 2 p.m. in the UK, and my name's David Mills. Welcome to a new year. Welcome to 2025, and welcome to the first of our weekly series of CGHE webinars. It's always a pleasure to start the year and thinking ahead. We're looking forward to our big conference in April. But I'm excited today that we've got a great speaker who's joining us from George Mason University in Washington, Marisa Lally. Welcome, Marisa. Thank you for getting up. We're looking forward to your talk. You've been working on the Fulbright Program and its geopolitical implications. Just a reminder, everyone, we will be recording this and posting it on our website tomorrow, so you can always find all of these recordings and the transcripts and the slides as well. And I think I suggest you keep your audio off. I'll make sure that when you come at the end to the Q&A, you post your questions in the Q&A, and I'll unmute you so you can ask a question live. And if you can't, just let me know, and I can ask Marisa for you. So with no further ado, Marisa, you're a postdoctoral fellow for the Advancing Collaboration for Equity in Marine and Climate Science project at George Mason. That sounds really interesting. I'd love to ask you about that, but really we should focus today on the geopolitical implications of educational diplomacy, the Fulbright Program, 1958-2023. So Marisa, the screen is all yours.
Thank you so much. I'll share my screen. Can we see it? Yes.
That's great.
Awesome. So I, as David mentioned, am currently a postdoctoral research fellow at George Mason University. I am calling from Boston, Massachusetts today. And I'll be sharing findings from a study that stems from my dissertation research and was also recently published in the Journal of Studies in International Education. So it's a section of my dissertation research. And I just wanted to say also thank you for having me today. I've really enjoyed past webinars, so it's really exciting that it's kind of my turn to share. So thank you again for having me.
It's a pleasure.
Great. So as many of you may know, and we probably also have some former Fulbright scholars, current Fulbright scholars in the audience today, the Fulbright Program is the US government's flagship international exchange program for students and scholars. It's its longest standing government funded international exchange program. And it was established in 1946 by Senator J. William Fulbright, who is leftmost on this photo here. This photo is President John F. Kennedy signing the Mutual Educational and Cultural Exchange Act of 1961 into law, which we also call the Fulbright-Hays Act. And it's still in effect today. It facilitates all government exchange, including the Fulbright program, and also things like the J visa program, which is the short-term visa program that a lot of Fulbright scholars and other short-term exchange scholars are on. So it's had a major impact on international education from a US perspective. So the purpose of the study that we're focusing on today is I wanted to focus on a prominent example of how the US uses international education for geopolitical advantage and really understand the inner workings of how it functions. And as I previously mentioned, the Fulbright program plays a major role in how the government contributes to international exchange in higher education. And so I argue that examining the ideologies that justify its existence will help us to understand broader inequalities that exist in international education. So the research questions that guided this particular study are: first, how is geopolitical power indicated in the discursive construction of US national identity in evaluation and report documents throughout the program's history? And so I've included documents from 1953 to 2023. So 70 years, which is, a little less than the length of the program's existence. And then second, what discursive strategies appear in the arguments that the Fulbright program's evaluation and report documents make about the missions and purposes of its exchange activities? And so as a theoretical approach, I'm focusing on geopolitics. I have this volume, if you haven't read it yet, this volume pictured here, US Power in International Higher Education, where lots of scholars consider how higher education systems, and specifically the US higher education system, is in a struggle for positional advantage or jockeying for a top position in the world hierarchy. So, and they explore different ways of doing so through things like soft power initiatives, which the Fulbright program is included in. Sorry about the sunlight. Quality assurance, university rankings, and other sorts of activities that we include in considering internationalization. Um, so the data source that I used, the larger study, which my entire dissertation study uses all sorts of archival materials, including photographs, student evaluations of the program itself, program agendas, policy documents, etc. But I decided to focus this study on a specific genre of document, which are report and evaluation documents. So these are documents that are the government itself, so the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs, which is a unit inside of the Department of State in the United States, how they evaluated the success of the Fulbright program. And the documents that I've included are various. So some of them are specific parts of the Fulbright program. So say the foreign Fulbright scholar program. So they'll evaluate just that section of the Fulbright program, which is the part of the program where the government sponsors scholars from other countries to come to the US and do short-term research projects or things like that. So that's one example. Another example, which I'll talk about later, is the uh, most recent document that's included and was conducted by some people that I think are on the call today, that is actually evaluating the whole system of US cultural and educational exchange, which includes the Fulbright program. So they're really various in what they're actually evaluating. And I chose to focus on evaluation because I think it serves as a genre that speaks to what the program itself considers to be its missions and purposes and whether or not um, they're successfully evaluating those. I used a method called argumentation analysis, which is a form or a kind of strategy within critical discourse analysis that illuminates arguments found in the text. So it takes kind of three steps. The first two being functional and formal analysis, which really helps me understand the structure of how something is argued in a text. So, for example, what does the reader or what does the writer assume that the reader already believes? What strategy does the writer use to contest or support that belief? And then conducting a content related analysis to understand, the content of the argument. So how is the writer making an argument and what discourse are they developing or perpetuating through its content? And I will kind of describe examples as I go through the findings. So let's discuss the findings. I'll be talking about four different themes that came out of my analysis. The first being the prominence of mutual understanding as a primary purpose of the Fulbright program. Second, the idea that international education has impacts that are ephemeral and difficult to evaluate. Third, that the programs have an inherent purpose to change perceptions towards the US in a positive way or positively. And fourth, that there are both internal and external geopolitical justifications for the program's existence. So I'll show examples of each theme that were present in the evaluation and report documents that I analyzed. And I hope it'll be fun because it'll go kind of back into history and we'll look at some old screenshots of old documents. So the first, as I mentioned before, the Fulbright-Hays Act, or the Mutual Educational and Cultural Exchange Act, is what is legally facilitating the Fulbright program. And there it stated that the purpose of this law or this chapter is to enable the government of the United States to increase mutual understanding between the people of the United States and the people of other countries by means of educational and cultural exchange. And so it's this is repeated throughout all of these documents because it is the status purpose that's in the law that's facilitating it. And these ideas started even before the act was enacted. And so there's I actually have an example here of how early this goes. So this is a screenshot of an article that was in the New York Herald Tribune and also the Christian Science Monitor in 1946 that was written by J. William Fulbright, who is the senator who was leading the implementation of this program. So I think you'll find it interesting. So the concept of mutual understanding is presented here. So he says, the more one thinks on the possibilities of this plan in promoting understanding between nations, now when the understanding is recognized as a goal of paramount importance, the more exciting the prospect becomes. I think what's really interesting about this article is that it's juxtaposed with an example of international exchange that predates the Fulbright program, which is the Boxer Rebellion Indemnity Act. So and that was a program that used debt from that China owed the US and turned it into educational exchange dollars. So he says the use of the Boxer Rebellion indemnity turned back to China for the education of the Chinese students in this country has had an incalculable influence on turning the thoughts of Chinese men of learning westward. So we can see this kind of imperial ideology that was juxtaposed with this mutual understanding concept. Putting into question whether mutual understanding is mutually beneficial. So the next theme is this idea of evaluating ephemeral concepts. So these are the most recently updated policies that are set by the Fulbright Foreign Scholarship Board, which is the board that's president appointed in the United States that decides the governing of the program. And what they say is that education requires a continuing act of faith. This is necessary because it is never certain what may be the effect of teaching and learning or where research may lead. For this reason, it is difficult to define precise and specific objectives of international educational activities or to demonstrate immediate results or quantitative accomplishments. And so I noticed that this concept has been repeated throughout history. The idea that evaluating something as ephemeral as whether or not we understand each other as citizens of different nations is it really possible? And it's in the act, in the policies themselves that you can't really measure something like the Fulbright program, and so we should have faith in it. And it's difficult to define the specific and precise objectives of international exchange activities. And these ideas were present as early as 1963 in this kind of overarching evaluation called the Beacon of Hope, which was presented in 1963. So it was a really early study of the program's impact after the Mutual Cultural Educational Exchange Act had been implemented, but for about 15 years of the program's existence. So the author writes that many of the effects of an educational and cultural exchange program are intangible. They cannot be measured by the research techniques now available, and we recognize this limitation. We have therefore deliberately used a wide-angle lens and we draw upon a variety of sources that capture the most comprehensive possible picture of the program. One way that the program has argued the impact can be understood is through this idea called the multiplier effect. And the idea is that the positive impact of the program can be seen through all of the interactions that the grantee has, and then that those interactions will then be multiplied by the interactions that those people have. And the one thing I wanted to point out is that starting in the 2000s and beyond, there has been more of an effort to use qualitative and quantitative evidence to demonstrate the program's positive impact. And I wanted to shout out one of the studies that was included as data for this study is the most recent report of the whole system level impact of the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs. The Fulbright programs included, but of course there are many other educational exchange programs that are included within this study. And they took a quantitative approach, and as far as I can tell, and I'm sure that we can get some insight during the Q&A, this is kind of the first attempt to use linear modeling, use statistical modeling to understand relationships between variables and to combine kind of large scale public data sets like from UNESCO, from the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs to understand the relationship between certain factors, including economy, gender, justice and freedoms, health and education. Reports prior to this report had done quantitative and qualitative analysis, but they really focused on survey data. So they had mostly used descriptive statistics that relied on students and scholars self-reporting. So this is kind of representative of a quantitative or kind of empirical turn in the evaluations, and it's quite recent, in my opinion. So the third purpose, or the third theme that I found when I was analyzing these documents was the idea that one of the main purposes of the program is to positively change perceptions toward the United States. So this is a 1977 report that was focused on the Fulbright-Hays program. So the Fulbright-Hays program is specifically, it's the only program that's actually housed within the Department of Education rather than the Department of State or the Foreign Affairs Department, the Foreign Policy Department in the federal government of the US. And the Fulbright-Hays program facilitates teacher exchanges, so exchanges between school teachers to do kind of professional development and curriculum development. And so this report's really interesting because it was written by someone who had quite a significant role. His name is Robin Winks. He had quite a significant role in the Fulbright program. He was on the scholarship board itself at one point and was a Fulbright scholar, and also had been commissioned to do this report in 1977. And this is one of kind of the more interesting findings, in my opinion, because it is quite, I don't know, salacious. But he writes, "We should not allow ourselves to become confused when, in the pursuit of excellence abroad, we are accused of intellectual imperialism. Imperialism is, after all, only the impact of a high technology society upon lesser technology societies. And despite the capture of the term by the political left, it describes a wide variety of activities, some defensible and others indefensible." And so this quote, I think, seems very, I don't know, shocking, but I also think these kinds of ideas are repeated in US discourses today in many ways. I think that there are, we just elected a right-wing government again, and things like Project 2025 are coming out that have whole sections on education using kind of imperial ideas. And I think that, it's helpful to look to the past to understand the present. In more recent evaluations, surveys of Fulbright participants are quoted saying things like, "The US is too often seen as the aggressor, and this program puts a face to US policy and culture in a positive way." So we see that kind of repeated throughout history. Finally, the evaluations address both internal and external geopolitics and the intersection of both. So we went back and we talked about the Beacon of Hope earlier. And that study was really wide-ranging. They traveled to many different locations and talked to facilitators of programs. They talked to previous participants of programs. They included many different countries in their study. And I wanted to include this example of how um, internal geopolitics specifically um, showed up in these documents. And so 1963 was at the height of the civil rights movement in the United States, and they included questions in their survey and their interviews about the racial situation in the United States at the time. And so this finding I found really interesting. So they said, we believe it's significant to point out that elsewhere in our 20-country study, proportionately more grantees from Africa than from any other area reported that they feel it important to tell their countrymen about the improving racial situation in the United States. The evidence of improvement that they cited were the attempts at social and religious toleration, government efforts to solve the race problem, federal laws against segregation, and the work of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP. We may judge this willingness to cite the improving racial situation particularly remarkable in that some African grantees had experienced racial discrimination in the United States. The incidents, as the grantees reported them to us, make sorry reading. And so this example bolsters the idea that racism was improving during an incredibly tense time in the US when it comes to race and racism. I think what's really interesting is, from a critical discourse perspective, is the idea that, and this is kind of what we do in qualitative research, of course, is we interpret the words that our participants are saying and kind of reframe them through a different lens. And I think that here we can see an example of that the Fulbright program and the African grantees that were participating in the program, of course, they benefited from the program, but they admit that they experienced racial discrimination and still use them as an example of how the racial situation was apparently improving in the United States. And this is all within the framework of the Fulbright program. So I thought that was kind of a helpful example of internal geopolitical justifications for the program. So external geopolitical justifications. This is from a 2017 evaluation. They discuss the program's purpose of maintaining the U.S. as a destination for students of the highest caliber and enhancing the capacity of U.S. universities, contributing to the advancement of scientific research in the US. And so this, as I was saying, the evaluations that I included were evaluating different parts of the program. So this was an evaluation specifically of the experiences of scholars in science, technology, engineering, and math who were visiting the US from other countries. And so they see it as a program. In this evaluation, they're evaluating it as a program that is meant to maintain the US as a destination for scholarly mobility, specifically in the field of science. And here you might be able to see the connection with my current work in marine and climate science, and especially racial justice in that area. So the goals here demonstrate that goal of maintaining a high or top position in the global higher education system. And so overall, I'm arguing that the evaluation documents use these argumentation strategies that emphasize national uniqueness and justifying education as a geopolitical intervention here. And also as a strategy to minimize internal geopolitical issues that have an impact on grantee experience and on their relationships with partner nations. And so I wanted to talk about some ideas that maybe can lead us into the discussion, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. So first and foremost, there are a lot of evaluation reports that are represented in my study from 1953 to 2023, and they use a variety of strategies to support and justify the existence of the Fulbright program and its positive impacts. So I want to consider, even though there are different times, different geopolitical contexts, I argue that the underlying ideological justifications have been maintained, and those justifications being that it's important to maintain a top position in a hierarchy, not only of higher education systems, but of of national systems of nation states as well. I'd also love to hear your thoughts on whether mutual understanding is a goal that can be measured. Is it necessary to be measured? Should it may be continue to be a goal of government sponsored exchange? I don't see that necessarily changing, but I just love to think about that with you all. And then finally, I think that understanding these underlying ideologies is important because of shifting geopolitical tensions. One such example of many, many different examples of um, how the Fulbright program has been kind of at the whim of geopolitics is the Fulbright program in China, which has been suspended since the first Trump administration due to a single line in an executive order that barred all sorts of relationships between the US and China. The Biden administration didn't get around to reinstating the program, and so I don't imagine that'll be reinstated anytime soon. And that's a big relationship that's been suspended there. So I'd love to hear kind of your thoughts about what you think. Um, Last but not least, as I mentioned, I have an article in the Journal of Studies in International Education. I can also put this link in the chat as well, if you want to read the full article and see lots of different examples, some that were included in the talk and some that weren't. They also have all of the references included. And and yeah, that's where I'll pause. So I'll put this in the chat as well. Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Marisa. That was you covered a lot of ground very quickly, and you've given us some very interesting things to think about. So please, everyone, do use the Q&A function to ask some questions. Some people, there is also a chat function, confusingly. So there are both options, but sometimes the Q&A is easier to use. Can I start, Marisa, just by asking you about the materials? What's interesting about evaluation, I think it's a great use of this grey literature, which is often neglected, often not easy to find, and creates a great corpus for thinking about almost the internal conversation that the program was having. To what extent do you have to read the evaluations themselves through the lens of the sort of their own, because an evaluation is usually commissioned not to necessarily tell the whole truth, but to sort of meet a particular need. I'm assuming that if the US government wanted to end the Fulbright program at any point, they would have commissioned a very different evaluation, perhaps, or given it a very different steer. So to what extent do we have to read the evaluation corpus itself as part of the project, and when and how critical can they be, whilst also being supportive of the project, as in not giving any hostages to potential people who might want to close down the program?
Yeah, I think that's what you just said is a large reason why I decided to focus on the evaluations as a genre. I think that what they really tell us is the ideology behind the program, because, like you said, it's hard for them to really be. I don't think objectivity is necessary in research, but it's hard for them to kind of pursue looking at impacts from a wide variety of angles. And so I guess to think about critical discourse analysis as a method is really helpful, because it asks me as a researcher to think about the social context in which the document was created. So the one example that I shared was of Robin Winks in the 1977 report. He was very clear about his political perspective. and he had a lot of power within the program itself, and that really makes the analysis a lot more meaningful because I can understand where he was coming from and what impact that could have on the program.
Okay, so what you're saying is really then that they are actually simply this is the discourse within the program. That people aren't actually trying to sort of develop a separate evaluating voice that is distinctive from the program itself.
Well, I think that has been true before. I think in the 2000s there was a really interesting turn, like I said, to be kind of have a more empirical focus, and so they did commission like third party evaluation um, evaluators, like third party evaluation organizations to do the reports, and I if you read them, yeah, they're very interesting. I think they still were very focused on the mission and the purpose of the program as mutual understanding and to show something positive. Um, I also think it's possible that the program does have a very positive impact on students and scholars, of course. I think, and I'm very excited that Dr. Chansiliani is here. Um, because I've included her study in as one of the studies in the research, and I think they've taken a very different approach because it's not trying to evaluate mutual understanding necessarily. It's trying to evaluate impacts on other factors like health, like gender equality and those sorts of things. And I'm wondering, it'd be nice to have that conversation about whether or not that really meets the goals of what the Fulbright program or the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs is trying to understand, and how they approach that conversation. So
Brilliant. Okay. Well, you've opened up some great thinking for us all, and we already have lots of people in the chat, so I won't ask any questions. Let's start with Eva Hartman, and then go to Rachel Brooks, and then go to Maya as well, given you mentioned Rachel. So Eve, and I've unmuted you all, so you can put your camera on as well if you want to. You may need to unmute yourself as well, but Eva, please.
Yes. Hello, everyone. Thank you for
Hi.
this really interesting study. So my question would be, it's more a general one when we study education diplomacy, a kind of a challenge that I'm also encountering, and I was wondering how you try to solve that. How can we avoid in our analysis to be too close to the actors that we study in order to avoid complicity? A classic example would be, soft power, that we study soft power, and of course the governments pretend that they have soft power, and we just repeat basically what they say. So what kind of analytical lens do you consider to be helpful to kind of get a bit of a distance from the program in order to develop a more critical understanding of its implications? Do you see what I mean? Because what is in the tin is not what is written on it. So we need a kind of more theoretical framework, I would say, that helps us to understand what is this actually a case of. So I was just wondering how you address that challenge that I think we all face studying international relations and education diplomacy in this specific case.
thanks for asking that. And there's like a relationality or positionality statement in my paper where I talk about how I'm a US citizen who was an English language instructor through the Fulbright program previously. And I I think that what has helped me is taking it from a historical perspective. And, if I had pursued it through an ethnographic perspective where I interviewed lots of people and I was living among people and I was going to the State Department and talking with people, it would have been a very different study, of course. Instead, I have created that distance by looking at archival materials. But of course, I think that I also believe that archival materials have their own emotional quality. In the full dissertation study, I actually look at participant evaluations from a Fulbright Hays program in China, where a group of U.S. school teachers go to China as kind of a team. They spend 6 weeks together in China and visit schools and go to lectures, and it's kind of a really detailed program that's kind of different than the Fulbright program we think of, where it's like one scholar going and doing their own research. And I felt like I was there with them. I felt like I knew who was causing trouble, who was, you know, I think that archival materials can create that closeness, but that's the approach I tried to take, to be able to look at things from a critical perspective. So I don't think it's necessarily possible to not be close to your own research, but that's what I tried to do.
Thank you so much.
That's great, and I think Marisa, what you're sort of saying, I totally agree about the sort of the relational aspect of what you're doing. I also think there's a sense in which it might be interesting to look at the commissions that were the evaluations, because actually often those documents that set out what the evaluation should do frame the parameters of what the intellectual conversation can be within that evaluation. Do you know what I mean? The evaluator is told what to evaluate, how to evaluate, what the terms of reference are. So that would be interesting as well. So I must go on, Rachel, and then Maya.
Thanks, David. Thanks, Marisa, for an interesting presentation. Somebody's actually already answered my question in the chat, but it'd be good to have your perspective too. So I guess when we look at kind of Europe, over the past kind of, I don't know, 5 to 10 years, there's been a much stronger emphasis on widening participation to international student exchange. We can see that in the Erasmus programme, for example, and it's a really strong element of the British Turing scheme. And I just wondered, I mean, you talked a little bit about kind of racism in your presentation, but are other sort of social identities considered, particularly sort of social class and that kind of thing? And is that a kind of a big focus of the Fulbright scheme? And I guess particularly in relation to kind of outgoing US students, because that's probably where there's more control rather than incoming students.
Thank you for asking that. Yeah, so the Fulbright program, I think that the strategy that they've been taking first has to do with partnerships with minority serving institutions, which in the US is a federal designation of historically Black colleges and universities. And there are other designations like Hispanic serving institutions. So an institution has to have a certain percentage of Hispanic students where they can receive that federal funding and federal designation. And so partnerships with those institutions has been one way to address widening participation for underrepresented students and scholars in the Fulbright program. And in the US, I think that things like social class and other marginalized identities are very much intersecting. So students who attend HSIs, there's a large intersection of Hispanic students and also students who are a low socioeconomic status. So that's one way that they've been doing it. I think so another thing, Dr. Gerardo Blanco and I have recently written an article that should be coming out in Change magazine. It's a publication for practitioners in higher education, where we analyzed which institutions are receiving the most grants. So despite there being this kind of investment in partnerships with minority serving institutions, kind of the same institutions keep getting the same amounts of grants. And a lot of that is because of this, at least from my perspective, is because the application process itself has a lot of kind of hidden curriculum, a lot of strategies for how to actually access these grants that other institutions haven't had the opportunity or the funding to really put their efforts into making that accessible for applicants. And so I think there's a long way to go there, but that's what I think they've been doing.
Thank you.
Great, thank you, Rachel, and thank you, Marisa. Marisa, you've mentioned several times Maya's big project. Maya, do you want to come
Yeah.
and ask a question as well?
This has been really interesting to hear, and thank you, David, for organizing. So I have a question, as Marisa has a lot of knowledge of all these evaluation documents, etc., while we lead a big project that looks at the systemic impact of mobilities, part of which are ECA, US State Department funded mobilities, but they are only a part of this project, and we are not evaluating any specific program. So it's more about the broader conceptualization and empirical understanding of the impact that goes beyond the individual. So you also mentioned evaluations that also try to measure that kind of impact, but I think nothing has been done on a larger kind of global scale that would involve US State Department as well as other funded and unfunded mobilities. My question is, and I'm really genuinely interested as I do not know and hope to learn, how much in these documents did you see about the mission or purpose or goal of international development, basically supporting these individuals so that these individuals then go back to their home countries and contribute to development in various ways. That could be through science, through economic development, opening up their businesses or working for government or introducing new legislation. So did you see a lot on that? Of course, there is a lot about public diplomacy and soft power and kind of more political interest, but I genuinely wonder if there is anything in any of those evaluations about broader societal contributions of these individuals.
Yeah, I think in these documents, I would say that there was less of an emphasis on international development. I wanted to say that I did not include annual reports in this study because I didn't consider them to be evaluative documents because they're reporting there's like sections that are like Fulbright by the numbers, and then they also do kind of like highlights of scholar experiences and things like that. And in those annual reports, I think there's much more of an emphasis on international development. So what types of projects have participants engaged in when they return to their home country? What types of research have they pursued that addresses kind of global issues like water, sustainability, and other issues like that? So I think that I hadn't made that connection before, but I think that is what I've been seeing, is that there's much more of a focus on kind of political, geopolitical issues in the kind of evaluation reports that I focused on, whereas international development, I think it's more of something that is kind of, it's more marketing oriented, I guess. Like these are the kind of the successes that we've had, and they're related to international development.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you. And Erica, you are a Fulbright Program campus advisor. You commented on how that's changing. Do you want to add anything to that?
Mm-hmm.
Sure. I mean, I guess I was more saying I don't think it is changing vis-a-vis those recent Supreme Court decisions. I haven't seen that. So I was doing that job, prior to that and after, and they really kept the same line. So they talk about it at a high level in terms of diversity, in terms of like the discourse from IIE for the U.S. Fulbright U.S. student program. That's the contractor that runs it, right? In terms of how they talk to applicants in their direct webinars, how they talk to campus advisors, and how they talk in terms of these partnerships. In addition to the partnerships, which is a really good point that Marisa mentioned, they are like having one-on-one, I guess you could say, communications directly to students or directly to individuals. And those are really emphasizing diversity, but they also talk about it in a broad sense. So they do talk about, they don't use the word class. I think they use the word socioeconomic, which is very typically American. But they definitely do talk about that, ethnic, racial background, etc., like that, all of those things, and any of your unique life experiences could be considered diversity. So that has meant, I think, that they've avoided that whole Supreme Court decision that has affected college admissions and other things because of the broad way they were talking about it. If I can add a little question into my comment for Marisa, I'm really interested because they do talk about it as, oh, this has always been a goal of the Fulbright program. This has always been something that the program has been interested in. This isn't new. I'm curious if that matches your historical look into this. Like, does that seem to be the case? Like, do you see any indications that they're talking about the diverse backgrounds of the applicants, you know, in a historical sense?
Thank you. So the one thing, just to comment on on your original comment, something that I think is interesting that's kind of new, and like you said, there is an emphasis on like diversity has been at the core of our program since its inception. There's a new, like a quite recent campaign called I Am Fulbright, where there's, you know, a group of previous participants, both from the student program and the scholar program, that come from a variety of diverse backgrounds, and they're saying, like, they say things in videos, things like, I am from a rural area, I am a first generation immigrant, like I am these things, and I am Fulbright, I'm a mother, like all of these different kind of people from diverse backgrounds demonstrating how that they represent Fulbright. And I think that it does speak to something historical, which is that the Fulbright program is kind of renegotiating its relationship to Senator Fulbright and his legacy. In 2020, when Black Lives Matter was at its peak, the Black student organizations at the University of Arkansas were really pressuring the university. So he was a senator from Arkansas, and the university has a statue of him. Their College of Arts and Sciences is the Fulbright College of Arts and Sciences, and they were really pressuring the university to reconsider their relationship to his name, because he had a record of voting for segregationist policies throughout his time as a senator. You know, some people say he was a Southern senator in that time. Other people say that's no excuse, and I'm of that. I agree with that argument that it's really he was part of creating that environment, right? So I think that, you know, the Fulbright program itself is coming to try to figure out how they're going to continue considering their relationship with Senator Fulbright's name. And I think this is emblematic of lots of different situations in the field of higher education. Of course, we have the Rhodes Scholarship. We have lots of other scholarships and lots of other parts of universities that are named after people who are colonizers, who are imperialists. So I think that he is part of that emerging discussion, which I think makes this research another reason that this research is important. So when we talk about kind of his dual legacy, when we talk about Senator Fulbright as a humanist internationalist and also a segregationist, like how do those things intertwine? I'd like to argue that, you know, there is a relationship between them. So that's kind of what I think that is adjacent to answering your question.
Thank you, Erica. That's a really helpful clarification. And Marisa, I think you're absolutely right to be thinking quite hard about this relationship, because as we wonder about what to do about names and the power of their names and their legacies, it does seem to me that one of those documents you say, well, imperialism is defensible. I mean, whilst no one is going to be claiming in a marketing brochure that imperialism is defensible, there is a sort of legacy thing going on. Martin, you've been very patient. You've had your hands up for a while. Please do come in.
Can you hear me all right now?
Yeah, perfect.
Yes.
Right. I actually, before I got to my point in the chat, on what Marisa just said, I may be one of the older participants in this call, as I was a college student during the height of the Vietnam War. And I just want to point out to those listeners who may not know anything about Senator Fulbright's history at that era, which is not to diminish what she said about his youthful embrace of policies that are now universally abhorrent in our society. But he was the most prominent congressional opponent to the Vietnam War. He was extremely outspoken at a time when it was when most members of our Congress were not speaking out against that war. He continued throughout his time to be that leader, and he wrote vociferous statements against the war. And I just wanted to highlight that especially important part of his career. It was at a time when, as we all know, our country was involved in a terribly violent episode in Southeast Asia. But so Fulbright, his memory amongst many of us who were activists on college campuses in that era, he is always remembered as that person. And I think it's just worth as a footnote here in this conversation to make sure that's known. Now, to my point, I was just in the chat, I said that let me get to my point here. The discourse that you're talking about, Marisa, on campus, I wondered if your view might be, could you comment on what we all know is going on in the United States now, which is the politicization of so many aspects of higher education, the fact of getting a degree itself, the value and worth of going to college, of certain institutions in and of themselves. And so that, do you see that is, and now going forward in the next 4 years, will we continue to have this class war going on in our society about the very value of obtaining a degree, let alone having an international education as a component of being in college?
Yes. So to refer to Senator Fulbright's stance on the Vietnam War, yes, of course, he was a major supporter of or anti-Vietnam War, and I think that is a huge part of his legacy. And of course, I can recommend some books on people who have written on that aspect of his career. He famously said something like, let's exchange bullets for books or something like that, like education, let's do education in exchange for militarization. That he really believed that education was as powerful a peacekeeper as any other thing. And I think that, that contributes to a lot of the discourses that we find in these evaluation documents. So that's one thing. To answer your question, can I clarify? So you're asking, do I think that higher education will continue to be politicized, essentially?
Well, I was wondering about the linkage in your mind between the politicization of the discourse about the value of higher ed before Trump became our president the first time. I mean, there was the idea of getting a degree and its worthwhileness in our society for young graduates was never really seriously questioned as a along political lines. And since Trump has become embroiled in so many of our key issues in the key issues in our society, and one of them being, why bother to get a degree? And he's fed this idea of education being an elitist enterprise to begin with, all around that. And therefore, I think it'll be more difficult to make the case that the inherent good of say having an international education and would also be questioned. I mean, it was always, I thought in my lifetime, being a well-educated young man, young woman was inherently a good goal amongst American families. People aspired to that, especially all immigrant families in America post-war. I think that was just seen as a worthwhile enterprise. I don't believe, and the election analysis points this out. I mean, there's this split is along class lines here of those who believe, it's not as important as you might think. And then there's this discourse about, well, you know, I'm earning a good living as a car mechanic, and there's nothing inherently wrong about that. So why should I strive to have my kid get a very, very expensive education, which will burden him with great debt? And therefore, I think I was wondering, as you were talking, the inherent good of having international education. And been involved in that field for 45 years. And so all these questions are new to the field when you go back in recent history.
So I guess coming into, just to sort of speed things up a bit, Martin, I guess a blunt question here for you, Marisa, is, is there any chance that the larger program might be shuttered?
Got it. I think a couple of things. Yes, the value of higher education broadly is obviously being questioned and puts universities around the world at threat, right? Universities certainly can and will shut down. And I think one thing that it made me think of is how universities, if US students aren't going to be attending college at the same rate as they previously had, or the value of higher education isn't seen as valuable or as kind of inherently valuable, as you were saying, as it used to be, then competition for international students will probably continue to be will continue to heighten among higher education institutions in the US. And there's a paper that kind of addresses this, is how international students, and often international students from China and other East Asian countries, are seen as kind of cash cows in the US, as seen as ways to bring revenue to higher education institutions. The Fulbright program, do I think it will be? I mean, it has been receiving less funding from the federal government over time. A big part of the Fulbright program, that a big argument that it makes, is that it's cost saving overall, because it's kind of this peacekeeping enterprise, and a lot of the funding comes from partner countries and also private investments. And so I think that if, it really depends on how invested those other funding sources are in continuing the program. But I also, with Trump, you never know what could happen. So that was kind of what I was talking about earlier. Like in one executive order, the Fulbright program in China is completely shut. That the Trump administration is not the only one. There's also the Fulbright program in Afghanistan had been suspended for about 10 years previously. There's lots and lots of examples where the Fulbright program does need to answer to the State Department. So it can't really be solely educational. I mean, I think all education is political in a sense, but this is kind of its own its own example. So I hope that answers your question.
Well, that's great. Thank you, Martin, for asking that, and also for the history lesson about Fulbright in Vietnam. I think we've got time for one last comment. And SK, I'm sorry, I don't know your full name, but you've provided a couple of helpful comments in the chat about your own work, but you also have asked a question directly now. Do you want to ask it as the last question now?
Oh, sure. And apologies for the label SK. So Stephanie Kim, I work at Georgetown University. Hi, Marisa.
Oh, hi.
Hi, thank you so much for your really interesting talk. Yeah, I guess I'll just ask the question that I dropped in the chat. One thing that we seem to be talking around but not explicitly stating is the Cold War politics around the Fulbright program, and how the Fulbright program often was used as a geopolitical tool during past decades. And I was curious if you could talk a little bit about how the Fulbright program specifically was used in that way, and what that might mean for how it's used now, especially as there are ongoing tensions with countries like China and other places around the world.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for saying that, because it is kind of explicit, and I've been speaking about it implicitly, about how the Fulbright program is emblematic of the Cold War and the cultural Cold War, or the Cold War of soft power initiatives and things like education, sport, music, etc. Some of the examples I can think of from my research are the emphasis on American studies during the 1960s, 1970s, when some of the Fulbright program in India, for example, some of the funding had been allocated specifically for American studies programs. And so I think that's an example of how the kind of cultural Cold War was manifested in a program like the Fulbright program. There's lots of talk during that period about how, for example, when they implemented the American Studies program in India, there aren't enough local scholars who would be able to take on those roles, and that's why we need to fund it through the Fulbright program, to have visiting scholars from the US actually do that education. And so I think that today we can see this in kind of allocations towards STEM fields like development of science and technology. I think that disciplinary emphasis on disciplinary on certain disciplines and funding those certain disciplines are emblematic of geopolitics broadly. So I know that we're out of time, but I thank you for your question.
Great, thank you, Marisa, and thank you, Stephanie. There's more we could say, and we didn't really get to the question of the hidden curriculums in the universities that attract these students, but hopefully we can come back and hear more from your work, Marisa, at some point. Thank you all very much for coming. Next week, we'll be talking about internationalization in Southeast Asia with Yu Zhang from OISE in Toronto. Thank you all for great questions, and particularly big thank you to Marisa for a really thoughtful presentation. And we'll now go away and look for your paper and read it. So thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.